Edward was often beaten by his wife, forcing him to endure that life for 29 years. Edward had simply stopped fighting back against her violence long ago. Whenever his wife simply lifted an empty coffee cup, Edward immediately stood up to brew her some hot coffee. To Grace, receiving Edward's constant attention had effectively become nothing more than a habit. She felt certain that no matter how poorly she treated Edward, he would never find the courage to leave. Edward was a high school teacher, and sadly, only when he was at school could he ever manage to smile sincerely. Returning home was undeniably the most painful part of his entire day. However, not only Edward felt that way, their son Jimmy also felt completely suffocated by the overwhelming pressure of his domineering mother. At every single family gathering, only Grace kept on talking, while Edward and Jimmy sat there in total silence. This dynamic went on continuously until the day of their 29th wedding anniversary. Grace was eagerly expecting a romantic surprise, but what Edward actually gave her turned out to be a massive shock. He calmly asked for a divorce. Grace thought he was joking at first, but when Edward looked her straight in the eye and said very seriously that he had actually fallen deeply in love with someone else, Grace realized it wasn't a joke. She still tried to assert her dominance over him, but this time, Edward firmly refused to stay a moment longer. He quickly packed up his things, called his girlfriend, and in a few minutes, she arrived to pick him up. After Edward had officially left, Grace finally realized how important he was in her life. She felt as if Edward still lived in the house. She even asked Jimmy to convince his father to return, but Jimmy refused. He knew his father leaving was the right decision. Maybe his father really should have left much earlier. Grace never expected that her own son would also keep his distance from her. That was the moment when she finally started to reflect on herself. Perhaps there really were mistakes she had made. She then went out and adopted a dog and named him Edward. She trained the dog to be completely obedient. Seeing his mother slowly change, Jimmy finally felt at ease. On the day the divorce papers were signed, Grace still hoped Edward would change his mind. But when she found out that Edward had left all his assets behind, she finally understood. Edward would never return. He preferred to leave everything rather than stay with her for one more day. Later, Grace began working at a helpline, where she listened to people's emotional struggles. While listening to the life stories of others, she slowly began to heal the deep wounds inside her own heart. One day, she went to Edward's new house. She wanted to see if Edward was truly happy without her. As soon as she entered, Edward panicked. He thought Grace had come to hit him again. Just then, Edward's girlfriend came out of the kitchen. Upon seeing her, Grace stood frozen. All this time, Grace thought Edward's new relationship was just an excuse to run from the marriage, but at that moment the truth was revealed before her. She let go of the desire to bring Edward back. Slowly, she learned to live on her own. And Edward finally didn't have to endure the physical beatings anymore. And in the end, he found someone who could lovingly make a hot cup of coffee for him.